So how did we get to this point? Let's back up even further. First, the history, which really starts at least as far back as 1916 with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which effectively divided the Middle East between the United Kingdom and France. France got the dominant position in Lebanon and Syria and opted to keep Syria together as one unit, despite the fact that there were stark sectarian and ethnic differences that are more evident than ever today.
Well, it gets to this point, Graham, that a lot of the countries in the Middle East are sort of artificial nations. Syria is in that collection, Iraq is in that collection, and they were held together under very brutal regimes that kept a lid on the ethnic divisions. But once that lid gets lifted by revolution in the case of Syria, by invasion in the case of Iraq, you never know what's going to happen. So, roughly speaking, what are the ethnic and religious divides in Syria? Who ended up with power and who was left out? Summer?
Well, as we discussed in an earlier segment, the Alawites are in, at least that's Assad's group, and they're 10 to 12% of the population. Syria is about 70% Sunni Arabs, and actually a lot of the wealth in Syria is concentrated among Sunni Arabs. It's about 9% Kurds, about 10% Christian, and 3% Druze. And frequently, as I mentioned, in terms of wealth distribution, Alawite order is imposed through patronage and intimidation.
When you think about Ernie's dividing line for similarities and differences, this really adds to the differences with Libya, certainly with Bosnia. There were ethnic divisions there, but it was not quite as cut up as you see in the Syrian case.
Right, and we should actually probably look at a map just to help us clarify this for a bit, because one of the topics that's now live for debate is whether Syria can ever be put back together again in its former borders, or whether it's going to end up splitting with the Alawites having a section, especially in the northwest, that they've been protecting, with the Kurds interested as being having as little to do with Syria as they can manage, with the various Sunni groups, perhaps one or two or three managing other areas. So I would say when you look at the map, you can see at least that's the shape of things currently, but there's no reason to believe that won't change also on the ground.
I'd like to interject here that this has been increasingly portrayed as a sectarian conflict. And while it in many ways increasingly is, it's to Assad's benefit and to the benefit of many other actors for it to be portrayed this way. And Syria, at many points in the past, was a very harmonious society in which these groups lived happily side by side. And many Syrians today would still feel very strongly that the world understand that they still feel that way about their neighbors. But the way that this conflict began was rooted somewhat in economic corruption in the 1980s. I mean, there are many different factors that have played into this, and there are a lot of political factors that have played into it taking on the sectarian nature that it currently does.
Extremely good reminder, because if you were to talk to probably the majority of Syrians today, they would point out just what you said, and they're proud of the fact that for many, many years, the Sunnis and the Alawites and the Kurds lived together quite successfully. Now, actually for centuries, but in the recent past, it was imposed order by a fairly brutal regime, which nonetheless kept people from killing each other. Just the regime killed a lot of them from time to time. So I think that as one's seen, nonetheless, these events roll forward, as you said, and especially in the context of the revolutions going on around it, you see now the Sunni-Shiite divide becoming much, much more vivid. You see also the ethnic differences becoming much more vivid. So I would say if I were betting it today, I would not bet that Syria turns out to be the state that continues to have the borders that it does in the foreseeable future.
Well, that's what happens when you have non-natural states. It's much harder to keep them put together.